Right. So we are recording. Harvey Silverglate, Stephen Bonnell, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Us.
And Stephen Bonnell. So Harvey, wanted to introduce you to Stephen Bonnell. He goes by the name Destiny. He's got to be like the most popular streamer out there. So he rose to fame with his video game streaming, and now he's a very well known political commentator. He appears on Piers Morgan and other outlets. That's kind of a weak introduction, Stephen. So I'm going to let you build it up a bit. But also, for those who don't know, Harvey Silverglate is John Eastman's lawyer, right? John Eastman is Donald Trump's lawyer. And Harvey, you're the co-founder of FIRE, so Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Did I get that right?
Correct.
Okay. Destiny, that was... Can you help me beef up your intro? Is that?
Oh, we're good. I just do online. I just scream at people online. That's all I do. Yeah.
All right, cool. So, Harvey, Destiny and I are hoping to talk to you today about a handful of things. If anything's off limits, just let us know. We'll move on to the next topic. But actually, let me pass the mic to you, Destiny. Why don't you ask a question?
Yeah, sure. How's it going, Harvey? You can hear everything loud and clear?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Cool. All right. So one of the things that I've been involved with lately is doing a lot of research around, obviously the two political candidates, Kamala and Trump, and the upcoming election, and stuff relating to all of the events that happened during January 6th, and kind of like all of the stuff leading up to that. I guess I'm not sure how much you can touch on things. For instance, when you say that you're one of Eastman's lawyers, is he like retaining you for counsel over the stuff that he's dealing with right now? Or how much are you able to talk about in regards to like the ECA, the 12th Amendment, and the whole legal theory leading up to that? Yeah, you can tell me what you're comfortable with.
Well, Eastman has two lawyers, Charles Burnham, who's in Washington, D.C., and me. I'm of counsel to a Boston firm, but I do most of my work out of where I am now, my home office in Cambridge. The whole top floor of the house is devoted to my work. I have two research assistants here, and so I mostly work at home.
Okay.
And
I guess, yeah.
I am co-counsel for Eastman. And I believe I was brought into the case because of my criminal law experience and my First Amendment experience. I am considered to be an expert in both criminal defense, academic freedom, and First Amendment. And the Eastman case involves all of those things, especially First Amendment.
What do you think of the First Amendment implications in the Eastman case?
Well, I think that the problem with the prosecutions are that they have not been thought through. A vast number of people have been indicted on a vast number of charges, some of which are clearly inappropriate. For example, Eastman, in my view, and I'm an expert on this, I taught legal ethics at Harvard, the Harvard Law School in 1994. This is one of my fields. Eastman's advice to Trump and to the rest of the group in Georgia and elsewhere was perfectly lawful. It was cutting edge. It was not the typical advice lawyers would give, but he wasn't retained in order to give typical advice. He was retained in an extraordinary situation to give advice in an extraordinary situation. And he is going to trial. We have let the prosecutors know that there will be zero plea bargaining. He's going to trial on every case in which he's been indicted.
So typically when a client and an attorney discuss things, usually there is a privilege for the attorney-client privilege that you're not allowed to pierce except for with limited exceptions, one being the crime fraud exception. Now, I understand we can call Eastman's advice cutting edge, but when Eastman is giving advice on how to break a law, haven't we done a problem there? Isn't that a no good from an attorney perspective?
You're making a huge assumption that his advice to Trump was on how to break a law, and it was not. And that's where you have made the fatal error, and where the Department of Justice and the Georgia DA have made fatal errors. They're going to lose this case. They're not going to lose it against all the defendants. But trust me, bring me back when the case is over, and I can do it, and I told you so.
Is the Electoral Count Act, is that not a law for you, or do you think that that's...
Not, the question isn't whether it's a law. The question is whether Eastman's advice was sound legal advice, and it was. There was nothing illegal about it. He was not urging the breaking of any law. He was acting as Trump's personal counsel, and that's going to be the defense.
If Eastman was having conversations with Pence and Trump and Mark Short and Greg Jacobs and encouraging them to contravene the ECA because of some different interpretation of, say, the 12th Amendment, would that count as him giving advice or counsel on how to break a law?
No, it would be he was counseling on how to deal with the law, not how to break it, but how to follow it in a cutting edge fashion.
Well, I mean, breaking the ECA, it wasn't following it. It was saying the ECA would be ruled unconstitutional, hopefully by a future Supreme Court, right? The idea was that law had to be tossed. No?
Yeah, you're allowed to do that. That's not the same as, burglary or homicide. You're allowed to do that.
You're allowed to have a unique constitutional interpretation in order to break the law. Well, but then couldn't you just break any law if you wanted to and say, well, I think that the First Amendment would allow this, or I think that the 12th Amendment would allow this, or?
Nope. The answer is no to that question.
How do you determine which laws are okay to break and which ones aren't based on a personal interpretation?
Sound legal analysis. Remember, he was an academic. He taught the law. Sound legal analysis. Each case has to stand on its own facts and its own law.
Okay.
See, the problem in this whole mess is that the thinking of prosecutors is exactly the same as your thinking. There is absolutely no respect given to nuance, to detail, to footnotes. These are all bulls in china shops.
Well, I mean, the issue is that the ECA had been followed for some 140 years, right? And we didn't seem to have any problems with it. And for somebody to come out with a novel constitutional interpretation that would just so happen to basically kick the entire ECA to the curb, and then Eastman would later even admit in personal conversations that the Supreme Court probably wouldn't defend it.
That's what they said about Brown versus Board of Education, and the Supreme Court decided otherwise. And I could tell you that I could probably name at least half a dozen cases. The school desegregation case is one. The Pledge of Allegiance to the flag is another. There are a large number, but maybe not large, but I could easily name 6 cases where the Supreme Court broke new ground because creative arguments were made by the ACLU, by FIRE, by my organization, and suddenly the law got clarified. Some would say got changed, but we expect to win ultimately, if not in the trial courts, in the appellate courts.
So for something like, if we think of something like Brown v. Board of Education, and we think of like equal protections, if we look at the ECA and we look at the 12th Amendment, on what grounds would we imagine the Supreme Court would end up tossing the ECA? That Eastman's interpretation of the 12th Amendment was just true, and he was the first legal scholar in over 100 years to figure this out? Or
it doesn't have to be accurate. It just has to be offered in good faith. The Supreme Court could, in the end, disagree with Eastman's interpretation, but that is not the question. Because if a lawyer, in good faith, mind you, gives advice that's the advice is under a creative interpretation, is possible, but at the end it loses. In a criminal setting, the giving of that advice is not a crime.
Sure, but I mean, I imagine we'd have to be able to figure out whether or not it's creative interpretation done in good faith versus bad faith, just for accomplishing somebody's personal ends or something, right?
Well, that's going to be for the trial judge to instruct the jury and for a jury to decide, and then for an appellate court to review the jury's decision based upon the propriety of the judge's instructions. We will go to trial. We expect to win. If not at the trial level, then on appeal.
Do you think that if Jacob's testimony is true and if Eastman admitted to him on first glance that they'd probably lose in the Supreme Court 7-2 and then they'd probably lose 9-0, does that speak to how good faith or bad faith the legal counsel might have been?
I don't understand your question.
So let's say somebody says we're going to challenge this law because we think that the 12th Amendment supersedes this law. This law is unconstitutional. And then, upon further investigation, when you're talking to this person, like, yeah, if we went to the Supreme Court with this, we'd probably lose 9-0. Does that speak at all to whether or not the legal advice is being given in good faith or bad faith?
Well, are you looking at this prospectively or retroactively?
This would have been prospectively before January 6th when Eastman was talking to Jacobs. I think Eastman said, or Jacobs testifies that Eastman said that if they were to go to the Supreme Court with this, they would lose 9-0 basically. And this was before January 6th, so this would have been prospectively.
The question is whether they will lose in the Supreme Court or not. I do not.
Yeah, but if you think you're going to lose 9-0, it seems like you're probably not giving advice in good faith. No, right?
No, I disagree with you. You could think you're going to lose, but you could offer cutting edge advice in good faith and not have committed a crime. You don't have to be right on an issue. You only have to be give your advice in good faith and a good faith belief. I've had many cases where a client has said, well, I'd like to go to trial. What are our chances? I said, our chances are very low, but it's up to a jury, it's up to a judge, it's up to an appellate court. And in some of those cases we've lost, in some of those cases we've won.
Sure, but I mean, there's a difference between saying, like, can you beat a jury or not, or can you win a jury trial or not, versus do we think that this person has, committed a crime, or do we think that this person is acting in good faith or bad faith, right? There are times where somebody's obviously committed a crime and almost for sure done it, but we wouldn't win in front of a jury or we couldn't get a conviction or something. It doesn't necessarily speak to whether we think the person was acting in good faith or not, right?
Well, I don't know. You keep asking me the same question, you're getting the same answer.
Sure. Okay. I guess my interpretation, looking at all of it, is it looks like Trump was very clearly trying to solicit opinions that would further entrench his power in the White House. And to do that, he stepped outside of all the official White House counsel, and he went to people like Giuliani or Sidney Powell or Chesbrough or Eastman in order to solicit whatever outrageous legal theories he could in order to try to maintain power. And Eastman was the one through Chesbrough that hooked him up with this crazy idea of just tossing the ECA and saying that the vice president himself could basically choose the winner of the election. And I don't see any reading of the 12th Amendment or the Electoral Count Act or the roles of any of the parties involved that would allow that in good faith to happen. Like you must have to have a totally different interpretation of the structure of government.
Fortunately, you're not on the Supreme Court. I'm glad of that.
I am not on the Supreme Court. Although, again, your client says that he would probably lose at the Supreme Court 9-0, so I don't know how that's relevant. But
I have given many clients advice, which I told them in advance we probably would lose, where in fact we've won. It is not criminal to give advice where you think you're going to lose, but it's offered in the good faith possibility that you could win.
Yeah, but if you're giving advice on how to break a law, the ECA is a law, and he was giving advice to break that law. This is literally one of the few.
You're being very tautological here. You're not giving advice on breaking the law. You're giving advice that you think might or might not be upheld by an appellate court. That's not the same as saying to somebody, pull this trigger and kill this person. Go rob a bank.
It might not be the same as breaking one of those laws, but the way that you just said in an appellate court, he's not talking about how the law in and of itself could be interpreted differently. He's talking about going up to the Constitution and doing a different type of interpretation of the Constitution to say the entire law should be struck down, which I think is, using that argument, I think you could argue basically anything. This is unconstitutional, so I'm going to give advice to a client on how to break, how many laws. Like, I think you should actually be able to do conspiracy crimes because that's a violation of your First Amendment right. You're just talking. Why should this ever be considered a crime? And then giving advice on how to carry those crimes out. I think that would be not good. I think we would all agree we would want attorneys to be able to give advice like that, right?
You keep making the same mistake. You're abusing the English language as well as logic. You're not giving someone advice on how to break the law. You're giving somebody advice on interpretations of the law that are unlikely but possible.
Okay. I mean, I think we know where we stand. We can circle the drain on this. Did you want to change?
So Harvey, where do you think that destiny is missing you on this? You're saying that, I think what you said is destiny is not understanding the logic of this, or he's using the English language in a way that where he's making a point that you think is fallacious. So
he doesn't understand the role of lawyers. That's the problem.
And what do you mean by that?
I understand the role of journalists. I used to be a journalist. You don't understand the role of the lawyer.
And what specifically? Just so we can move on. But I just want to try to find the specific point of disagreement. You know, what is kind of underneath this? What's the foundation of where there's this disagreement? So what specifically is destiny not understanding?
He's not understanding that it is not easy to understand and interpret all these statutes, especially in a situation which is unprecedented. And that if a lawyer comes up with an interpretation which the lawyer thinks is probably wrong, but which the lawyer thinks could possibly be upheld, you know, the current Supreme Court, with its conservative majority, has overturned precedents that were half a century old. Nobody would have predicted it, but it happened.
So
affirmative action just got overturned the last term. It's shocked all the universities. So it happened.
So just to be clear, when we're talking about Dobbs, when we're talking about Chevron being overturned, one, this is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is in the purview of the
about Chevron, by the way.
Well, I know, but you're talking about these are overturning things. These weren't laws, right? These were other prior Supreme Court decisions.
We're talking about overturning the affirmative action, college affirmative action case. That's the one I referred to.
Oh, I heard Roe v. Wade. Sorry.
Destiny, does Harvey's critique make sense to you? Do you agree or disagree with what he said? In other words, I think what he's saying is there's the nuance to the law that maybe he thinks you're losing in your analysis, that you're not accounting for the specifics on how the laws work and can be interpreted. Is that fair?
No, I understand what he's saying. I think that as a general piece of advice, I think what he's saying is absolutely correct. That there are a ton of different laws on the book. Some of these can be contradictory. Some of these can be untested for long periods of time. And when you go to an attorney and you're trying to navigate, especially like a novel environment, you might ask it, like, can I do this? Is this against the law? And it's like, well, this is untested. Like, we could try this. Like, I think that an attorney is squarely within their rights when they're operating in good faith to give advice like that. I think as a general rule of thumb, for sure, that's true. And then even more precisely, there can be important challenges to things where you think, well, I think you have a First Amendment right to do this sign, or, whatever, where these cases work their way up through the courts because you have people that are willing to represent defendants that are trying to test certain things. I think as a general rule of thumb, everything he's saying is correct. I just don't think any of it applies to the Eastman case. It's very obvious that Eastman's not offering advice in good faith. He thought he would lose to the Supreme Court. We're not talking about like a smorgasbord of complicated federal statute or regulation. We're talking about a very clear Electoral Count Act that's been followed pretty much to the letter for 150 years. And the advice that Eastman is giving is not some like cutting edge novel theory on how you could maybe, work within the bounds of this law. He's saying that you would have to violate the ECA at multiple steps, and we would have to appeal to the 12th Amendment as being the thing that would save us, which is another common logical fallacy where people put constitutional amendments or constitutional law on the same level as congressional statutes when they're not. And the idea that somebody could just come in and go, oh, actually, I think this is unconstitutional, which this determination would only happen in the Supreme Court. And Eastman himself says that this would lose in the Supreme Court, first 7-2. And he's like, I would actually probably lose 9-0. Shows me in my mind that the advice is not being given in good faith. He's giving advice to his client on how to break a law, assuming that the Supreme Court won't even hold it up.
You're describing the school desegregation cases.
The segregation cases?
Yeah, school desegregation cases.
How? In which way?
Well, who would have thought that Thurgood Marshall was going to win those arguing them in the Supreme Court? But he did. It was unprecedented.
Weren't those argued under equal protections?
Yes, so
So there's a legal argument that you could see there, right? That case, I think it was only 14 pages long. The argumentation for that case is constitutionally and legally sound, that the equal protections guarantees that if a state should pass some law or provide something, you have to.
Only because a majority of the Supreme Court suddenly did the unpredictable and said it was legally sound. It was not legally sound until then.
Do you think there's no way to see if a reading of a statute in how it would comply with the Constitution, you don't think there's any way to know if that's sound or unsound before 9 judges say if it is or isn't?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I think that we can probably say there are some challenges that are done in good faith, and there are probably some challenges that are done in bad faith. But with the way that you've laid out Eastman's case, it sounds like there's no way in your world there could ever be a bad faith challenge. Because you're saying, well, the Supreme Court's done crazy things in the past. Maybe they will say that all forms of conspiracy to commit crime are all illegal.
Absolutely not true. If you have somebody now who is running a lunch counter who refuses to serve a person on the basis of race, religion, national origin, that's pretty clear. There are some things that are clear. If you have somebody who goes into a bank with a gun to make a withdrawal, that's pretty clear. There are issues that are so obvious that even an idiot can understand them.
Yeah, this is not one of those cases, though, right? The ECA, in terms of, I don't see how you could ever do a reading of the ECA of the 12th Amendment where it's so obvious that the vice president should be able to just toss the entire ECA. And I don't see how you can ever say that the advice is being given in good faith when he says he would plan on losing in front of the Supreme Court. And the advice you're given is to break a law.
No. The advice was given. Let the courts decide. It was obvious it was going to be litigated. Let the courts decide. It's not you're not doing, exercising power out of the barrel of a gun.
Well, but you are. If you can't say, let's break the law to circumvent the election, and then we'll let the courts decide at a later date.
You're talking in tautologies here. He didn't give advice to break the law. He gave advice on how to get around a certain result by interpreting the law in a creative way.
It was a rejection wholly of the Electoral Count Act. The reliance was on the ECA being ruled unconstitutional. So breaking that law. It's hoping that law won't count.
That's correct.
So how is that not breaking the law?
It's not breaking the law. It's allowing the courts to test the law.
But in that case, then an attorney could never give you advice that's bad then, because you could always say, I just want the courts to test it, no?
Let's get on to something else, because we're just going around in circles here.
Okay.
And just to put a pin in this, so I think the point of contention is Destiny is saying, well, how do we know if you can stand behind any law being potentially broken, then it's impossible for anything to ever be in bad faith because everything is defensible. Destiny, is that kind of to summarize your point? I think what you're saying is that okay. And then Harvey, what you're saying, we'll move on. I think what you're saying is Destiny is wrong because it's not the case that anything is defensible. There are certain things that are indefensible that you can't defend in good faith, and this is not one of them.
That's correct.
Because the nuances of this case meet the threshold, which you would say is there's enough ambiguity. There's enough ambiguity, Harvey, you're saying that it's reasonable for someone to be doing this in good faith, and it's not fair to say that they are necessarily in bad faith. Is that accurate?
Correct. And thankfully, in our system, it's up to a jury to decide that, not up to the trial judge and not up to journalists or commentators or anybody else.
And so, Harvey, if I were to try to make this, quantify this a bit, for the sake of this conversation or for Destiny or myself, is there a way to describe what that threshold is where you would say, okay, that person's clearly breaking that law, trying to defend that is got to be bad faith? Or maybe there is no threshold. Maybe it's for interpretation. I mean, would you say where would we draw the line?
Well, we don't draw the line. Ultimately, the courts draw the line, and ultimately, it's the Supreme Court that draws the line.
So, Destiny, why don't you think what Harvey's saying
Hold
is
on, I have
reasonable?
to wait. I'm so sorry. I have to say, just real quick, for any aspiring lawyers out there, the idea that you would just operate as a criminal co-conspirator and hope that the courts figure it out is probably not the advice you would give any attorney, right?
I don't think
Like,
that's what he's saying. That's not what he's saying.
This is a tautology. You keep saying operating as a criminal. Not everybody would agree. I don't agree that he was operating as a criminal. I have been a lawyer for 60 years. I did very well in law school.
That's fine, but I don't think you would tell an attorney to just say like, "Oh, well, give him this advice, and we'll let a court figure out if you're about to get disbarred or
not." That's not what I'm saying. You
Harvey,
putting
clarify
words in my mouth. This is insane.
So, Harvey, I think so just for the sake of clarity, could you restate your point that because I think Destiny,
a lawyer in a difficult legal situation is entitled to give cutting edge advice that 98% of his fellow lawyers might think is wrong, but which has a sufficient chance of persuading appellate courts that it's offered in good faith. It's not offered it's not being implemented out of the barrel of a gun.
Yeah.
It was obvious it was eventually going to get into the courts. And it's perfectly lawful to give such advice. And you can't go around indicting lawyers for giving cutting-edge advice. It's very bad for the legal system.
And Destiny, you would agree that there are cases where lawyers can defend a client for something that might be illegal, but it might not be illegal, right? And they can do so in good faith. And I think what you're saying is that in your opinion, in this specific case, you don't think there's any chance that there was anything legal going on. And so, Destiny, you think it's done in bad faith, right? But
my understanding, and I'm not a lawyer, I've never been to law school, but my understanding is one of the few exceptions where you can pierce attorney-client privilege is the crime fraud exception, which is when you are getting advice from a lawyer or an attorney for making plans to break the law, basically. And if you're enabling a client to break the law, not defending somebody who has broken the law, but you're like planning with them, that's one of the few times that you could be held one that veil can be pierced, and then you could be held criminally liable for it. I think that's why
Destiny is engaging in what we call a tautology.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that. I was about to ask you, what do you mean by tautology? You've mentioned it a few times. Can you describe that?
Yeah, you say where a lawyer is advising a client on how to break the law. That is not what that's a conclusion. What he was doing was advising on an interpretation of the law that will allow the client to do what the client wanted to do.
Wait, you keep saying that, but that's not true. He wanted to break the ECA. He didn't want to reinterpret it. He wanted to break the ECA, which is a law from Congress. It's breaking the law. There's a plan to break that law.
How is he trying to break the law rather than get around it? What is there no difference in your view?
Well, yeah, the ECA is what set forth the procedures to be taken place on January 6th, and it dictated what the vice president should do. And Eastman's memos, both of them, gave advice on how to break from the ECA procedures.
Now, wasn't it obvious that was going to end up in the courts, sort of like Bush versus Gore? Wasn't it?
I don't even know if that is going to end up in the courts. Is it? Is that even?
Why would it not end up in the Supreme Court? Why would that not be reasonable in Eastman's mind?
Because it's not reasonable. It's ridiculous. And that's why Eastman himself said it would lose 9-0. There's no sane human being that would have this interpretation. You're clearly just soliciting the help of an attorney for a crime. What?
Harper, what did you say?
The current Supreme Court has made some decisions that, shocked the New York Times, for example. All the precedent, isn't it obvious? Well, it wasn't obvious to 5 members of the Supreme Court. You just don't understand the role of courts of ultimate jurisdiction. They can say whether or not something is ridiculous or not ridiculous. It's not up to us.
Harvey, you mentioned something interesting, that there's a difference between trying to get around a law versus breaking it. Can you help me understand that difference?
Yes. Getting around it is figuring out an interpretation that would allow you to do what you want to do.
Yeah.
And done very openly, so that if somebody wants to engage in appellate review, they can go to the courts. This was not a secret conspiracy. The whole world knew about what was going on.
Destiny, do you agree with that? Do you see what his distinction is making between getting around a law versus breaking it? What do you disagree with there?
No, he's breaking a law. I think this is a strange trick sometimes that people play when they try to put the Constitution on the same level as congressional statute, and it's not. They were saying they wanted to break it wasn't favoring one interpretation like the 12th Amendment over the ECA. The Constitution does not sit on the same level as congressional law. And the idea that Eastman himself could give this determination that like, oh, well, obviously he's going to say I'm committing a tautology again. But in his world, there's no way to break any law ever as an attorney. You can never, there's no such thing as the crime fraud exception, I guess, because every attorney can say, well, I'm just giving novel legal advice. Like, there's no way to do it.
So let's talk about this. When is someone breaking a law?
Here's a very specific example. I go to an attorney and I say, I really want to, there's a lady down at the store and she always gives me this evil eye. Okay. And I want to kill her. Okay. So give me advice on how to do it. And the attorney goes, well, personally, I think it's my First Amendment right to give you that advice, and I don't think that there would be any sort of a conspiracy to commit crime thing that would happen here. There is no conspiracy charge.
That's the wrong amendment, by the way. It's the legal advice of counsel amendment.
Sure, but I'm saying, what if this attorney thought that he could help his client plan a crime to murder somebody because he thought that was his First Amendment right to do it? So whatever
you are equating advising a client to commit a murder with advising a client on how to get around the statute concerning elections, you're so often left field. I can't deal with it.
Both of them are advice on how to break a law. No,
you use
around the law.
Conclusory terms. Break.
Yeah.
Those were Eastman's own words. Departure from the ECA, breaking the norms of the ECA. They're breaking the ECA. That was Eastman's own words.
Well, Harvey would say he's getting around it, not breaking it, right, Harvey?
No, he's not getting around it. He's breaking it.
Okay,
that's correct.
Okay, well then you're just getting around the laws on conspiracy to commit murders.
Well, Destiny, is there a difference? And I'm not a lawyer either. Is there a difference between a law where you say, this law is either bogus or it's not perfect. Let me see if there is a way to work around that law. Is there room in the U.S. legal system to, as Harvey said, get around a law? And is that different from breaking a law? Destiny, what do you think?
Yeah, there's going to be differences. When somebody says get around, now again, remember, I'm not a lawyer, I haven't been to law school, but in my mind, when somebody says get around a law, what I'm thinking of is they found a way where the law doesn't apply in a particular way.
Yeah.
They think that it doesn't apply for some reason, or you don't fall under, whatever's declared, it affects these people or whatever. But for the Eastman advice, they knew that it applied here. Obviously, it was the process.
What do you mean they knew that it applied, but they're saying they don't think it applies?
No. That's yes. Harvey keeps saying that, but that's not true. He knows it applies. That's why when Eastman, every time in this this gaggle of lawyers, not including Harvey, but like the Eastmans, the Giuliani's, just when they say constitutional, that's a code word for breaking the law. Because what they're saying is we think that these laws are BS and we want to get rid of them, so we're going to follow the Constitution instead. That's what they're saying. They're not trying to get around the law. If they were trying to get around the law, they would never have to appeal to the 12th Amendment. They would just say, oh, well, this law doesn't apply here. That's not what they said.
How would they say it doesn't apply there? What would they use?
The major tests of constitutional principles have been brought, the only tests have been brought by people who broke the law. Unless you break the law, it doesn't
With advice of a lawyer?
It doesn't get into court as a test case. In the school desegregation cases, which I use as the prime example, those kids black kids who went into the white schools broke the law. They intended to test the law, and the only way to test the law is to break it.
We're not talking about clients. We're talking about attorneys. You would agree there's a difference between an attorney finding a client that he wants to defend his broken.
Were advised by attorneys.
And so if an attorney is advising you to...
Do you think 7-year-old kids made the decision to try to get into white schools? They were advised by lawyers.
Well, generally, your parents are the ones sending you to school. And I think there probably were a lot of parents that were telling their kids that they wanted to go to school regardless. But there's a difference between somebody breaking the law and somebody defending you versus you breaking the law on the advice of an attorney.
Can I make a suggestion? We've been going through this merry-go-round now for an hour.
Yeah, and we'll move on.
Okay.
We're never going to agree.
Well, the crux of the disagreement, and either of you should correct me if I'm wrong, the crux of the disagreement is that Harvey is saying it's not necessarily breaking a law if you're trying to find a way through the law, around the law. Like, the laws have flexibility. And Destiny, I think what you're saying is, like, Destiny, would you not attribute any flexibility to the way that we can deal with laws?
Yeah, you can. The distinction that we're that is not being made right now. I don't, for some reason, is there's a difference between a client breaking a law and a client breaking a law by the advice of the attorney telling them how to break the law.
The whole breaking the law. Okay, Harvey wants me to move on, so I'm going to.
There's no difference between those two things, Harvey. There's no.
Harvey, talk to us about Fannie Willis.
Okay.
Fannie Willis made a huge mistake.
What was the mistake?
Okay, she actually made several huge mistakes, but let me tell you one of them.
And Destiny, sorry for this silly question.
No,
Are you familiar with Fannie Willis and the circumstance around that? Or? Fannie Willis.
She's the one with the case in Georgia for the RICO case, right?
Fannie Willis is the district
attorney of Fulton County, Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
She made two errors. Number one, this was a case that could have been very simple. Instead, she decided to bring a RICO charge. What is RICO? It is a state version of a federal statute. RICO stands for Racketeer Influenced Corrupt Organization. It was developed by Congress on the advice of the FBI and the Department of Justice to try to get entire crime families convicted. This was an anti-mafia statute. The theory was that if you could indict everybody in a mafia household, yet would include the cooks, the waiters and waitresses, the chauffeur, because after all, they overheard the conversations that were going on among the mafia members. So the idea was that if you could indict the cooks, the chauffeurs, and the waiters and so forth, they would be the first ones to crack and to agree to testify against their bosses in exchange for leniency. That was how the Department of Justice broke these mafia families. Now, Fannie Willis fancied herself an anti-mafia crusader, essentially. She brought this ridiculously sprawling indictment against a large number of people. The best estimates were, it would take a year and a half for everybody to prepare for trial. And it would take a year and a half to try the case. First of all, it would have to be broken down into 3 different trials. You couldn't try everybody together. And so you're talking about a 3 to 4 year undertaking costing Fulton County millions and millions and millions of dollars, much of which was going to go to her boyfriend because she, instead of relying on the paid salaried employees in her office, she hires her boyfriend at a $350 or $400 hourly rate. Some of that money ends up being used for vacations for the two of them. She's lucky she won't be indicted when this is all over. She could have brought a simple, ordinary conspiracy case. It would have taken 3 months to prepare. It would have taken maybe a month to try. It would all be over. It would not cost the county millions and millions of dollars. It wouldn't have enriched her boyfriend. It wouldn't have paid for the vacations. As I said, she'll be lucky if she gets out of this thing without being indicted. The trial judge said that one of the two of them, either she or Wade, would have to resign from the case. She let him. She sacrificed him so she could stay on the case. And we appealed that. We're going to win that appeal. There's no way if he has to get out, she doesn't get out. And as I said, I think that there is borderline criminal activity the way the money was handled in this case. So I expect that there's going to be a new prosecutor appointed. And I believe we will be able to convince a new prosecutor to withdraw the indictment, at least against John Eastman, for a lot of the reasons that I have already expressed.
Destiny, thoughts there?
I've only been following the closest case to follow are the federal ones. And so I've read the Georgia indictment, but I haven't followed the personal life to try to discredit the entire case based on what we think about her hiring whoever she does for the investigations for the prosecution.
I'm not discrediting her. I'm telling you the trial judge has done this. He was appalled.
Okay.
Well, what do we think about the idea that Trump asked Georgia? He said, hey, can you find the votes? I mean, Destiny, what do you think about that?
I mean, obviously, it was an egregious overstepping of the boundaries when he called the election investigator. That was a horrendously inappropriate call when he was trying to bully and harass Secretary of State was Raffensperger's role, right? Secretary of State, I think, and then to try to get them to to convince them of 50 million different lies about voter fraud. That whole phone call was unbelievably unacceptable. Yeah, the thinly veiled threats of like, this is illegal and you guys know you're engaging in criminal activity. It was just ridiculous.
Can I respond to that?
Please respond. Yeah.
Okay. There was nothing wrong with that phone call because he didn't put a gun to anybody's head. He said, can you find the votes? Tell me what's criminal about asking that question.
When the person that's the head of the executive branch, which has the Department of Justice underneath it, is accusing you of knowingly facilitating crimes, I think that almost every reasonable human being would interpret that as some type of threat.
Well, I'm sorry, you're wrong about that. Okay. Most reasonable lawyers would agree with me, not you.
Why is that?
Okay.
Because there were no threats made. There was a question asked. And the mere fact that commentators think the question was unreasonable doesn't mean it's a crime.
What do you think about that, Destiny? I mean, what Harvey's saying is that you can say, can you find the votes?
I don't know if that act in and of itself, that phone call in and of itself was a crime. I didn't say any of it was a crime. I said it was wholly inappropriate. I think that it might go towards the conspiracy, the obstructing our rights from the Jack Smith case. I think that it might go towards that. But in and of itself, no, I would just say it was disgusting and wholly inappropriate. I don't think it was a thinly veiled threat. But I don't know if any of that hour phone call was criminal or not.
It's not.
So Destiny, you don't think Trump tried to steal the election in Georgia, or do you?
Yeah, he absolutely did, of course. But there's not a crime for stealing an election, or there's not a crime for trying to get somebody, a state legislature, to flip their vote. I don't think it's
you keep saying it's not a crime to steal it. It is a crime to steal an election. It is not a crime to come up with a far out interpretation in an attempt to win an election. You know, the abuse of language in this whole thing has been horrendous. The use of language assumes a conclusion.
I mean, there's always a conclusion assumed to some extent in a court case. An indictment isn't brought with, in neutrality. Obviously, there's going to be an assumed, I think this person's committed a crime, right? The whole reason why a prosecution brings criminal charges to somebody is they think they can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, or at least get a plea out of it, right?
You know how easy it is to get an indictment from a grand jury?
What reasonable suspicion is
the number of times that a grand jury has not followed a prosecutor's advice to indict somebody can be counted on one hand of fingers of one hand.
Wait, what? So what do you think that means?
That means that if a prosecutor wants to indict you, the prosecutor can get the grand jury to indict you. You
don't think you're putting the cart before the horse there?
Just a second. You know how the grand jury works? 23 members of the community are in a room. The defense lawyer does not show up. Only the prosecutor shows up to address them. I won a case in which a grand jury refused to indict my client because I made a motion to the judge, who's in charge of the grand jury, for the right to show up in front of the grand jury in order to tell them why I thought the prosecutor was wrong and asked them to indict my client. The prosecutor objected vehemently. The judge said I could do that. I showed up. It was my only time I appeared before a grand jury, and my client was not indicted because it was the exceptional case where both sides were presented to the grand jury, but grand juries get only the prosecutor's side. That's why the saying is it was the Attorney General, Robert Jackson, before he got on the Supreme Court, who said, a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich. That's a very famous quote from somebody who ended up on the Supreme Court. These grand juries will indict a ham sandwich.
And your evidence for that is because the majority of indictments are made when a prosecutor goes to a grand jury looking for an indictment, right?
I've been practicing criminal law for 60 years, and I think I can count on my fingers the number of cases in which a grand jury has refused to indict when a prosecutor is recommended.
Okay. Do you think that might be because if a prosecutor is going to a grand jury, they're not trying. First of all, for an indictment for a grand jury, we're only looking for probable cause, right?
Correct.
For an indictment, okay. But you're not bringing an indictment if you think you can only prove probable cause, right? Aren't you doing it because you think you can convict in front of a jury beyond reasonable doubt, which is a much higher standard?
Well,
Wouldn't that explain more why 95% plus of federal cases aren't just brought on indictment, but are ended up being convicted or plead? Like, doesn't that show that there's probably, yeah.
I think that the prosecutors made an assumption that with the assistance of an ignorant and compliant press, the media, they probably could influence the grand jurors as well as the trial jurors.
Why do you think that the vast majority of federal cases end in conviction if the indictment process is so easy? Wouldn't the indictment, if you could just indict a ham sandwich, wouldn't you expect the conviction rate to be so much lower?
For the most part, prosecutors are ethical. They only bring charges where they think that they can prove them beyond a reasonable doubt and where their legal theories are correct. In this Trump era, there is a kind of national insanity going on. We haven't been able to think straight. Trump has been such a divisive figure. And by the way, I'm not announcing any support for Trump. I have made no public statement whether I support him. I have my personal views, but I don't mention them. I have a client here, and so I'm not mentioning my personal views about Donald Trump. But I'm saying that the news media have been on a jihad, and they have been collaborating with prosecutors. And unfortunately, and defense lawyers have not spent enough time talking to the press and explaining some of these things.
Okay, so firstly, thank you. Then it's not just random indictments are made. Most prosecutors are making indictments that they think they can prove in court beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's not just that all indictments are easy to get. It's that they're probably only bringing indictments so they think they can win in front of a jury. I agree with that. But then the second part here is you're saying that these are just like Trump derangement syndrome is essentially what you're accusing people of having. There were 4 major criminal cases, before it was the federal court and then New York and Georgia. The New York one ended with convictions. That we've got 3 other cases. Where's the evidence, or why do we think that these cases are being brought improperly if the only one that's gone, fully through the process has been in front of a jury, Trump has been convicted on? It seems to be the case that the
case you're talking about, the case in New York State Court.
Yep.
What's the relationship between that and the federal case against Eastman? They're wholly different animals.
Well, sure, but you made it sound like the case is all against like Trump, and I guess the people around Trump are just being dumb because
I'm only talking about the cases in which my client is a co-defendant.
Okay. And you think that those cases are unfair right now because, well, I guess going back to our first topic, you think it's just offering legal advice?
They're unsound. Okay. Forget about unfair. They're unsound legally.
When you say unsound, or well, we can go, yeah. Where do you want to go, Jake?
Based on flawed legal theories applied to facts that are contested.
Quick time check. Do you guys both have a hard stop in 15 minutes?
I'm good for whatever.
Harvey, are we pissing you off too much? Or how
I'm
much
not
do you guys?
pissed off at all. I'm incredulous at the ignorance shown about the law here.
Yeah.
Wait, hold on. Wait, I gotta ask. Wait, what ignorance? What am I not understanding? Help me. You got access to a huge audience right now. There's a lot of people who are going to see this. Help me, because I come down very squarely on the other side. Yeah.
What you don't understand is the line between good faith and bad faith interpretation of complicated laws.
Okay. I don't know. Maybe I'm being presumptuous. I don't see what's complicated about the ECA and the 12th Amendment and what Eastman was advising Trump to do. I do agree there are complicated laws. I read through the Chevron case and the example cited. There's very, very complicated stuff for sure. But the ECA, the Eastman stuff, none of this seems that complicated.
So Harvey, help us.
Do you realize the shock that the news media was in when Chevron was reversed by the Supreme Court?
I'm not here to defend the news media. The news media is crazy. I agree with you. People make a lot of stupid comments in the media about.
I think Harvey's point is that sometimes we think. Sorry, let me not make your point for you. Sorry, yeah. I think what you're saying is that in that case, we thought that law was a sure thing, and it wasn't.
No, I agree. And I agree with Harvey. Media says a lot of really stupid things.
Yeah.
I think the Chevron case, especially Gorsuch's concurrence, I thought was written really well. I came into that thinking he was going to be stupid. I was like, oh, okay, I get it.
So what do you
I agree.
agree. Does Harvey have a point? Like with the Chevron
No,
case?
no, because it's appeal. Well, okay, because I'm asking for a bit more respect, and that's fine. I understand because I'm a legal idiot, and I understand that. But I've read through a lot of these cases, and I'm not just trying to be the media where I'm saying like, oh, all of this is so horrible and so bad. Like I think I can at least read the writing. I've gone through the relevant portions of the ECA. I've gone through the 2 different memos that Eastman had written. I've gone through Chesebro's original suggestions, and I've gone through how they were going to apply that to the 12th Amendment. And I've gone through the depositions of Short and Jacobs and everybody in talking about this. Nothing about this seems complicated. And I feel like what we're doing is we're playing this game. Like, well, sometimes law is complicated. Sometimes it is. I don't think it is here. I think it's very simple.
Harvey,
what's going on here?
What is Destiny missing?
What am I missing? Yeah.
What you're missing is the fact that the law is not as simple as you think it is.
In what way, in this case?
Well, we've been through this a million times. I have an interpretation that I believe is reasonable. Destiny has an interpretation he thinks is reasonable.
Yeah. Why don't you think Harvey's interpretation is reasonable?
Hold on, it's going to be up to the courts to decide.
Yeah.
I think that Eastman's interpretation was reasonable. It'll be up to a court to decide, and I predict we're going to win that.
Okay.
And then Supreme Court immunity, Destiny, is that something you wanted to touch on, or? No?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to, yeah. I haven't heard a great defense of the immunity ruling for Trump. This doesn't impact Eastman's case at all, but, well, actually, that's not true. I guess it could end up impacting Eastman's case. But
I am not opining on Trump's guilt.
Okay.
I'm not defending Trump.
Okay, fine. So, it's funny that we're arguing so much about this because Destiny and Harvey, you guys have more in common than you have different, I think. Both of you are advocates for free speech. Both of you have an impressive track record at challenging censorship successfully, and both of you care about civil liberties. So Harvey Silverglate is not only the lawyer for John Eastman, but Harvey Silverglate, you're the co-founder of FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, an organization that defends free speech on college campuses and fights broader civil rights. And
fights for broader civil rights, right?
What did I say?
You said fight civil rights.
Fights
for civil rights, right?
I'm tired, man. I gotta.
No, you're good.
More. I'm exhausted. Okay, fights for broader civil rights. Thank you. You both of you guys have been vocal in challenging censorship in different ways.
Well,
Destiny
I'm a free speech absolutist.
You're a free speech absolutist. What about you, Destiny? Are you a free speech absolutist?
I don't know what that means. In general, I'm like a pretty big proponent of free speech, but like I think obviously you shouldn't be able to post like criminal threats. You shouldn't be able to post like child sexual material. You shouldn't be able to post. I think there are reasonable limitations on speech in different online platforms. So it just depends on what you mean by that.
Well, the Supreme Court has been unanimous on this issue. The exceptions to free speech are threats of immediate violence, defamation. There are 4 exceptions to absolute free speech. I'm okay with those. But other than that, I'm an absolutist on free speech. I believe that the First Amendment means what it says. The Supreme Court agrees with me. I also believe that the Sixth Amendment means what it says, the right of a lawyer to represent a client zealously within the bounds of the law. I have my own view of where those bounds are. I believe my views are accurate.
And both of you care about civil liberties, right? So, Harvey, you have a history of defending freedoms of the legal system, and
I spent 30 years on the board of the ACLU of Massachusetts. 2 of those years as the board president, and I co-founded FIRE, which is even more absolutist than the ACLU. So I believe this stuff. I have a long track record.
I'm curious, do you have an opinion on the Dominion versus Fox News lawsuit? Did you go through any of that, or?
Well, what is that? That has nothing to do with free speech, does it?
Well, I mean, it was a defamation case having to do with how Fox News was reporting on Sidney Powell's claims relating to the Dominion voting machines.
Well, I haven't studied that case. I don't.
Okay, all right, that's fine. I'm just kidding.
Destiny, what are your thoughts on the issues
You're
with
talking
speech?
about that's commercial defamation, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was involving companies. Yeah.
Yeah.
Destiny, what are your thoughts on free speech today? Do we need more of it? Is it too much of it? What are the issues with where you see censorship coming in?
I think the issue right now relating to free speech is it's not we're none of it really has to do with the Constitution or the law at the moment. I think the issue is that the main controllers of free speech are kind of like these huge social media platforms that are private companies. So I think we're kind of in a weird world where it's very difficult to address how it should even look, because some people will take the First Amendment and try to apply it to a private corporation, and it doesn't really work. But like private corporations are obviously holding on to a great deal of our ability to speak right now.
I think that Destiny, by the way, has touched upon one of the premier free speech issues of our era. And that is the fact that so many of the vehicles that carry speech, which we used to call common carriers, are privately owned. And they therefore are not easily subject to the First Amendment. It's a huge challenge. Facebook and Twitter and huge challenge. Twitter, Elon Musk controls a huge amount of the communication in this country, and yet he's a private citizen with a private company, and he can do what he wants. But I think that this is a real problem because it's no longer used to be that public utilities had this kind of power. Now they could be sued under the Constitution. Private, Facebook and Zuckerberg and Elon Musk are private citizens, and we're going through a lot of soul searching, national soul searching now to figure out how to deal with this new landscape. It's a real problem.
Yeah, like theoretically, like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, well, just those two guys could get in a room and they could decide that they want to, tomorrow censor all liberals or censor all conservatives. And I don't know if there would be any legal ramifications for that. They'd have to go in front of Congress and I guess fight with people a lot. Maybe Congress will make laws, but right now there's nothing on the books to control that. And that's pretty scary, I think. Yeah.
Yep.
What do we do? What do we do? What needs to be done?
Well, this is being debated now. I have mixed views about it. As a civil libertarian, I don't want to see the government controlling private companies like this. But on the other hand, I am irked at the concentration of this kind of power in the hands of individual multi-billionaires. I would hope that eventually it would be solved by a multiplicity of these moguls who don't all agree with it, with one another. But I don't know how it's gonna shake out. Private owners of what used to be public utilities. I did quite a bit of litigation on this before Facebook and before Twitter. Which I prevailed in, because public utilities were regulated by the federal government. Remember, AT&T. But do you need me? Okay. Were regulated, but Musk and Zuckerberg were not regulated, and they have an enormous amount of power.
Yeah. So we'll have to regulate them. Destiny, what do you think of the biggest issues right now with the Republican Party? Republicans. I mean, I know you're a pretty hardcore Republican yourself, so I don't know. I'm just kidding.
I mean, I think that the country kind of survives on basically a relatively informed public, and then institutions that can kind of disperse power and maintain, some kind of like trusted social order, through the people acting in them. And I think that the conservative movement has undermined and worked to undermine a lot all of those third-party institutions, and I think that's really scary.
Can I respond to the question?
Yeah, absolutely.
I am dismayed at the trajectory of both major political parties. I think that the Republican Party has taken on some fascistic far-right characteristics. I think the Democratic Party, which used to be liberal, has been taken over by progressives. And civil liberties doesn't count very much among fascists or progressives. I used to be a Democrat, and I am now a registered libertarian. I am not happy with either major political party.
Do you agree, Destiny, with the issues that Harvey said about the left, the Democrats?
I think there are issues with progressives. I don't think they've taken over the Democratic Party. I think that they're pretty common in like schools for sure. But I think that the Democratic Party holistically is still pretty center left. Like if you go to Congress, you're not going to find a bunch of progressives in Congress that are trying to shut down, civil liberties or free speech. You're going to find the crazier people on like college campuses, basically.
Can I raise another issue?
Go for it. Yeah.
I was very upset when Biden pulled out of the race, which was it was obvious. In that debate with Trump, it was perfectly obvious he was going to have to pull out. He should have pulled out the next day. Instead, he went weeks and weeks. And Kamala Harris was anointed the candidate. This was a tremendous opportunity for democracy to perform. The Democratic convention should have been an open convention where anybody wanting to vie for the nomination should have been able to do that. Instead, it was a coronation. I was very upset by that. And I thought it showed a weakness in the party. It was, the word political bosses is sometimes overused, but it did seem to me that the bosses were in full power at that convention. The coronation was immediately decided upon, and there was a great opportunity for an open debate as to which. And the Democratic Party has some great candidates who would have, if there was an open convention, I bet you would have had 3 or 4 fabulous candidates who would have contested the nomination with Kamala Harris, and we would have said the better man or woman would have won. So I'm upset with the process.
I think that choosing Kamala Harris was good for legal reasons in terms of how the funds could be spent from the campaign, because it was the Biden-Harris campaign that raised the money, so that simplified that process. I think that Harris was on the Biden ticket. Biden-Harris is who we voted for. Biden-Harris was the ticket running, so it makes sense that she would step up next. In terms of having an open convention versus letting it flow through to Harris, you could have, but it's already incredibly chaotic that Biden, is stepping down so shortly before the election. The idea of also throwing us into an open convention past that, I think is just so much risk. I think that, they're still following the delegate process. Like theoretically, Biden could have died. And if Biden dies, the delegates can pledge, to Harris if they want. There's not it doesn't have to be an open convention afterwards. So yeah, I think the process strategically, was followed well. An open convention wouldn't have been good strategically. And by the letter of the process, they followed everything they were supposed to. So I'm okay with how it turned out.
What Harvey's saying is that people would have benefited by a more open coronation, right? Right, Harvey?
Yes, exactly.
What do you think about that, Destiny?
Absolutely not.
No,
I think that there are people who don't like a center-left candidate. There are people who wanted a candidate that was much further left, and those are the people that were usually screaming for an open convention. So like the Young Turks, Jimmy Dore, a lot of people that maybe won't even vote Harris anyway, or we're all saying there needs to be an open convention. These people were never voting for any center-left Democrat. They all wanted like a Bernie Sanders-esque figure or somebody like that to step in. I didn't hear a bunch of Gavin Newsom supporters saying we need an open convention. It seemed to be all far left people, but maybe that's just the media bubble I'm in. I don't know.
I'm interested in what Destiny thinks about whether we need more than 2 major political parties.
Okay, hold on. Just a quick thing. I blame Jake for doing this. Okay, my name is Steven.
You don't go by Destiny on your stream?
No, when I do follow, no, I'm Steven. I used to be a pro gamer. That's just whenever, just call me Steven.
Oh, I'm sorry, man.
No, you're fine.
You should blame me. Yeah.
No, you're good.
Steven. Oh wait, hold on. Don't you? If I see you on Piers Morgan, don't they say Destiny? Am I crazy?
It's just because that's what my YouTube channel is still named or whatever. But I try to go by Steven. Yeah.
God, thank you. Sorry about that, Steven.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I think the 2-party system is okay. I think that there are other ways to do it, but I think you would have to fundamentally alter the legislature to do it. because we don't do like coalition governments. We don't have a parliament. We do the election by popular vote. I think you would have to change a lot of the infrastructure in the United States in terms of how we vote and how we do parties in Congress in order to have more than the two parties. Because right now it seems like the only thing a third party can ever do is spoil, which is not good, obviously, if you're part of that party. Yeah.
So there you go. What do you think about that, Harvey?
I think reasonable minds can disagree. I don't expect there to be much change in this.
What do you think we should have, Harvey?
With regard to what?
With regard to the party system.
I think we're better off with 4 parties: a progressive party, a liberal party, a conservative party, and a fascist party. We do have fascists in this country, and they should be identified. They should self-identify by joining a party of the far right.
So, Stephen, and any other questions for Harvey? Things you wanted to get off your chest or ask about?
How do you think generally the behavior was of everybody involved with the college protests? Do you think that the schools handled themselves well? Do you think they were respectful enough of the college protesters' rights? Do you think the protesters were taking things too far? For the pro-Palestinian protests? I'm just curious.
I think that college administrators have to be like judges in this respect. They have to maintain complete political neutrality. And, I'm most familiar, because I live in Cambridge, with Harvard and MIT. And Harvard finally has a president and a provost who have adopted the Chicago principles of political neutrality. Harvard no longer has a foreign or domestic policy. It is a campus where these issues are debated freely and individuals are entitled to make up their own minds. But they don't show up at congressional hearings and pronounce, oh, Harvard believes this on this political issue. Harvard is made up of people who would barely sit with each other in a cafeteria, much less agree on a political issue. And finally, President Garber and Provost Manning have announced political neutrality. And with regard to student demonstrations, I think the Supreme Court has been very clear on the line between a permissible and an impermissible demonstration. You cannot disrupt classes. It's sort of like, Boston had this controversy recently because there were demonstrations outside the home of Mayor Wu. And the lines have been drawn by the Supreme Court very clearly. You can have a noisy demonstration during the day. You can't have it at 3:00 in the morning when people are trying to sleep. You can have a noisy demonstration out in the central square of the town, but you can't have it outside of an old age home or a hospital. The Supreme Court has been very good on free speech. This is true of liberal courts and conservative courts. One of the few things that the current conservative Supreme Court agrees with the prior liberal Supreme Court on, they get unanimous decisions on the free speech cases. The lines are very clear. And I think that wise college administrators read these decisions and follow them. And it's true now at Harvard, finally, after a lot of turbulence.
I'm curious, one more question. What do you think about the structure of the Supreme Court in, like, say, putting term limits on so each president gets one nomination, or expanding or shrinking the court, or whatever people talk about this? How do you feel about the current institution?
Well, I
of the Supreme
wouldn't
Court?
mind term limits. I would make them long. It solves this problem. There have been examples of justices of the Supreme Court, and also federal judges on lower courts who have been senile. And that is a real problem. One of the great justices, one of my judicial heroes, William O. Douglas, stayed on the court too late. So I wouldn't mind having a long term, 16, 20 years, something like that. I think expanding the court smacks too much of what Roosevelt tried to do when he tried to pack the court. It didn't work. It was one of the few, I thought Roosevelt was one of the great presidents in American history. And I'm not alone in that thought. But his attack on the Supreme Court was a blemish in an otherwise superb record. I don't think that packing courts is a good idea in a democracy dedicated to the rule of law.
Do you have any opinions on like ethics enforcements, in terms of like Supreme Court justices accepting gifts or anything like that? Do you think that
you have just touched upon an incredibly difficult issue? Because some of the stuff done by Justice Thomas, for example, is appalling judgment, accepting expensive trips and gifts from very wealthy friends. I mean, appalling. But the question is, in a system of separation of powers, can Congress establish ethical boundaries, or does the court have to do it itself? I think probably Congress can do it. I don't think, but, and here's the catch. Ultimately, the question of whether Congress can do that was up to the Supreme Court, because it's the Supreme Court. So you need a constitutional amendment to change that, and I'm very nervous about fiddling with the Constitution, because God knows what would be done to some of the First Amendment, for example. Basically, I have a feeling we're going to end up kind of plodding along, trying to deal with this, and hoping that front page newspaper reports embarrass enough of the justices that they don't do stuff like Thomas has done.
Okay. And then one other question, I guess. What do you think is the biggest...
Are you going to share your thoughts on this?
I mean, I think that
Stephen.
Oh no, you're good, Stephen. Yeah,
Steven.
I mean, I think I think ethics guidelines are probably incredibly important. Like the whole argument for the Supreme Court lifetime appointment and everything was to keep them politically neutral, so they don't have to run for re-election or make politically advantageous decisions. And it seems like accepting gifts basically destroys the entire concept of that if you can donate enough to a Supreme Court justice, maybe he'll rule favorably for you. And especially since the Supreme Court as an institution has no protection of itself, right? It's not the executive. It can't do things. It's not the legislature. It doesn't get voted on by the people. Even if there isn't impropriety happening with the decisions, the perception of impropriety could be enough to destroy the legitimacy of the court, which I think is an issue.
Stephen, do you think Congress can enact ethical guidelines for the Supreme Court, or is that a violation of the separation of powers?
I don't actually know.
Neither
but
do
the
I.
Idea of,
Neither does anybody.
The idea of that happening and then a Supreme Court justice suing Congress because they would, I guess, be the ones that would have the standing to do it, or something, and then they would be in front of their own colleagues at the Supreme Court. That would be very interesting. Yeah, I have no idea. Final question, I guess, or just for me, just something I'm curious about. What do you think right now is the greatest threat to the capital F freedom that we have in the United States? What do you think right now are like one or two of the biggest things that Americans, you wish they would kept in mind more, or that should be kept in mind in terms of threats to our freedom right now?
Well, that's a very good question, and my answer may surprise you. I think it is the level of divisiveness of vituperation that has been shown in discussing issues in this country. I'm 82 years old. I've been through the Vietnam War protests, and I was born during the Second World War, when we were incarcerating Japanese just for being Japanese. We've had some threats. We've had the McCarthy period. I was a young kid when that happened. But I think that the extreme divisiveness and is it too strong a word to use? Hatred shown by American citizens against other American citizens simply for disagreeing politically is very dangerous. And to me, it's very disturbing. I think that civil discussions, like we've had some pretty strong disagreements in the last hour and a half or so, but it's been civil. And I think that the decline of civil disagreement is very dangerous.
Why?
Because it destroys the cohesiveness of a society when that society may have to face a real emergency. Right now we're dealing with terrible international threats. We have resurgent China that's looking at Taiwan. We have Putin who is looking at Ukraine. We have the North Korea run by a family of sociopaths. This is a very dangerous period right now. And I fear that if we don't have some sense of national unity, despite political disagreements, we're not going to be able to deal with some of these challenges. So I think that civil disagreement among people who agree on basics like democracy and liberty is a real challenge to this country.
You agree with that, Stephen?
Yeah, 100%. It's kind of funny, actually. It reminds me of, there's like a really popular, I think, marriage counselor. His name is Dr. Gottman. But I think one of the things that he points out is that if you have a husband and a wife and you hear them fighting sometimes, that's a good thing because they're still communicating to some extent. But when both sides completely shut down and stop talking to each other and there's no fighting, that might seem better, but it's not, because now the communication has been totally severed and then both sides are just drifting really far apart.
That's a very good analogy.
Yeah. I think the scary thing that I feel right now is I grew up, my mom comes from Cuba. She moved here when she was 5. So that half of my whole family was very, very, very conservative. So I grew up in kind of like the neocon era. I never thought I'd feel this way, but I kind of miss that back in those days, like the far left, your cosmopolitan liberals they were there for all of our like civil rights and stuff, kind of largely. So like the, gay marriage and, equality, fighting for affirmative action, stuff like that, which is in limited extent, I think all of these things are fine. And then your conservatives were there for, America's we're the world police. We need to be hawkish on foreign policy. We've got big businesses and we need to protect them. And, America and the troops and our patriotism, and both sides kind of like fought on those lines. And I feel like one of the sad things is the Conservative Party today, in my mind, is no counterbalance anymore on the left because they veered off in this wholly different direction. Like, I don't feel like the Conservative Party has the strong, super American patriotic vibes anymore. And they seem to hate all of our foreign policy and they hate all of our big businesses. And now you just have the left. And like, there's almost no world where I'm not voting for Kamala Harris at this point. But my God, her economic policies are very, very, very far to the left of mine. And, like the idea of talking about like price controls and stuff like this, these are not things that economically I would vibe with at all. But there's no good counterbalance anymore on the right, it feels. So that's just disappointing to me. Yeah.
Yeah. Harvey, thoughts on that?
I don't disagree. And I don't think it's inconsistent with my statement that the two sides are not speaking to each other now.
Can I ask? Oh, actually, wait. I'm so curious. For somebody that went through the Vietnam protests and everything, what do you think? Do you think the internet has had a largely negative impact on discourse? Because you've got people that'll say like students today are radical at schools. I say this, but then you look back, like students at schools have always been radical, right? The Vietnam era, it was a testament to that. Do you think things have changed in terms of how kids at school are radicalized or how we communicate because of the internet? Or what do you think are the major contributors to that in your eyes?
Well, I think that one of the problems with like the internet, it has given a platform to people who number one, people who are uninformed, people who are stupid, people who are provocative just for the sake of provocation. It has given platforms to people who otherwise could, for example, never get an op-ed into a newspaper because of stupidity, or dishonesty, intellectual dishonesty. So suddenly everybody has a platform. And how this all works out in a democracy with a First Amendment is still to be determined. I don't want to see federal regulation, but on the other hand, I'm appalled at some of the stuff that is posted. So I have I grew up with newspapers, and I have no suggestions for how this is going to happen, how it's going to work out. I suspect that it will be worked out eventually, but there'll be a lot of pain before that happens.
Can I ask how you reconcile your views of freedom of speech with like media responsibility? Because as somebody that was around on the early internet, and I'm sure you have some similar feelings, the internet was awesome in that it was literally the ultimate like anarcho-libertarian domain of anybody could post a website, anybody could say anything. And that was like a really cool idea initially. But as the internet has now kind of coalesced around a few websites, a few alternative media commentators, and then you see how horrendous and far out a lot of that has become. Yeah, in your mind, how do you reconcile the idea of like freedom of speech is good, absolutist freedom of speech, everybody should be able to do whatever. But man, in an open environment, it seems like free speech people make really bad decisions sometimes around things like media.
Well, I am a free speech absolutist, and I recognize that sometimes that produces bizarre and dangerous counterproductive consequences. I don't see a solution for it other than the free marketplace of ideas, which was proposed. The phrase was the phrase of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. I still think that the free marketplace of ideas is the best solution. And I think things will gradually work out. But right now, there's a real challenge and there's a real temptation for regulation, which I'm opposed to, because I think that the cure could be worse than disease.
Okay. Yeah.
Curious, Dustin, if you, Stephen, if you agree with that.
Maybe I can see it going every way. Yeah. The question I always ask if I think of some government regulation, I just try to think of like, if the party that I don't like is in power and they could wield that regulation, how would I feel? And usually that makes me reconsider a lot of, what I would think. Like if we think that some kind of strong government regulation or federal regulation on free speech on the internet would be beneficial, then I would think, okay, well, let's say Trump wins the election again. Would I want him to be able to wield that regulation? Probably not. So then I kind of walk back on it. I do think it's a difficult problem to control. Yeah.
Do you agree with what, Stephen, do you agree with what Harvey said earlier about the issue with the Democratic Party? What do you see as the issues with Democratic Party? Do you think there are major issues or they're being overhyped?
I think that to borrow from my cringe progressive friends, I think diversity is a strength in the Democratic Party, and that because it's such a wide tent, I do think that it kind of tempers a lot of the more radical rhetoric, like the Palestinian protests and stuff. That not to get into crazy foreign policy stuff. Okay, I'm a kind of an Israel simp, but I'm also a Ukraine simp, so I guess I'm like the pro-war guy right now. But I think that even though you've got those really radical elements of the party, the people that go out and they protest and everything else, like the majority of the party being so many different groups of people, I think tempers kind of the more radical aspects of it, which keeps it all kind of in line with itself, I think. Like for whatever we think about the Biden stuff, the fact that the party could kind of like sort of come together and say, okay, Biden, I think we need to have you step out. And even the media was like, oh, Biden's performances aren't good. In some ways, I think that's a testament to the party's strength, because on the Republican side, Trump is unassailable. And anybody that would dare to question, like, maybe Trump needs to step aside, like, you're gone. You're going to be deleted from either the party, as some people have been, or you're going to be deleted from the media apparatus, as Trump has tried to do. And now he's trying to do again with Fox News. So, yeah.
Does the Republican Party really stifle dissent, Harvey, do you think?
Well, as I said, I have adopted a policy of not talking about Trump.
Yes,
because he's a co-defendant of Eastman, and a former client of Eastman. But I'll say this: I'm not happy with the two-party system right now, and I wish we could have a more robust collection of political parties. I don't think we should have 12. But it would be nice to have a liberal party, a progressive party, a conservative party, and a fascist party, so that people can go to their corners and at least have some clarity. I think that would be better than the mishmash we have now. Of course, it's also said democracy is a messy system, so maybe I'm looking for too much neatness.
Harvey, what do you think are the 2 or 3 biggest problems with the Democratic Party right now in terms of their policies or behaviors or anything else?
Well, I think both parties are facing serious problems and questions. I think the most serious thing facing the Democratic Party is the split between the traditional liberals and the progressives. There's a kind of civil war going on, and the Republicans had the same situation. There were the arch conservatives, and then there were the Mitt Romneys. The Republican Party has been largely taken over by the Trumpists, which is a remarkable development. And again, I won't talk about it on the merits, except to say that it's a remarkable development. I mean, there have been very popular leaders of the Republican Party. I think Dwight Eisenhower was very popular leader of the party, but he didn't have the kind of power that Trump has. It's a real phenomenon,
But the biggest problem with the Democratic Party right now is this split between the liberals and progressives. Is that right, or is there something? Would you say that's the biggest problem within the Democratic Party, or is there
the biggest problem? Because, as I said, I think the Democrats should be split into a liberal party and a progressive party.
Yeah,
I have trouble seeing how all these people are going to live under the same roof.
Do you agree, Stephen, that that's a big conflict?
I don't think it is as big as Harvey says it is, but I mean, especially if you spend all of your time doing like freedom of speech stuff, I could definitely see you're coming into conflict with like looking at what's happened to the ACLU, looking at what goes on college campuses. I could definitely see why the progressives are like they're in all places. But I feel like literally if you just step outside of the school ecosystem, I feel like the progressive influence severely diminishes. Like I said, even in Congress, like progressives don't even like Bernie or AOC anymore. They've like completely given up on the lawmaker side of things. But yeah.
Do you think, Harvey, that the Democrats are over-indexing on DEI or other what people call like woke initiatives? Do you think that's a problem for the Democrats?
I consider, first of all, I'm a huge opponent of DEI in schools. I consider it brainwashing. They're ideological positions, and I don't believe they should be imposed, especially on young students. My own view is that in education, instead of having these stupid diversity programs, and believe me, I've attended some of these sessions, they are stupid, that what we should be doing is investing in early childhood education so that students can think for themselves and they don't have to be indoctrinated. It was also the reasons for my opposition to affirmative action. I think that affirmative action has allowed public schools from kindergarten through high school to be lax in preparing people for college because they don't feel they have to because they figure the kids are going to get in through affirmative action. So it's been a betrayal, especially of minority students. My late wife and I had one son, but in fact, we also raised a very good friend of his who was a black kid who's never knew who his father was and whose mother was not really very well qualified to raise him. So she actually asked if he could live with us, as he was already a very good friend of our son. So I used to sit and listen to them do homework in the fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade. And the black kid one day said to my son, "I don't have to do this assignment because I'm going to get into college anyway through affirmative action." I barreled into the room and I said, "Look, you got something called self-respect. You do your homework. If you get into college, you want to understand that you've gotten in on the merits." And he did. He did very well. He got in on the merits. He has a very productive life, has 4 kids, and runs a nonprofit for kids without fathers, interestingly enough. But that really colored my view of affirmative action. That what we should be doing is educating these kids rather than telling them that they're going to get a leg up because of race or religion or ethnicity or whatever the hell the standard is.
What do you think, Stephen, about affirmative action and DEI?
These are always like such boogeyman terms. I have to know like the particular policy, and then I can have like an opinion on it. Basically, like DEI is used so broadly. There are times where I can see affirmative action being used in a way that I consider probably fine, and there are other times where I say this is obviously not okay. Like if you've got some quota where you accept 1,000 students, then you've got like 100 extra applications you can accept, and you weigh like a child's background and their race comes up in that, and you might give preference to broadening the types of people at the school more. Like I don't think that's a bad thing. But obviously, like if you're saying that in order to fly an airplane, you need 500 hours of flight time, but for candidates that are Native American, we're going to say that's 50 hours. I would say, okay, well, this is obviously not okay. So yeah, when it comes to things like a DEI or affirmative action, I just need to see I have to see like the policies as written, and then I would go into whether I agree or disagree. Because I've seen some stuff that seems fine, and then I've seen some stuff that's really stupid.
Harvey, can any DEI or affirmative action be good or helpful, or do you think it's all?
First of all, I think affirmative action, I've always thought it was unconstitutional, and now the Supreme Court has agreed with me. And I think it's been an easy out for a society that is not willing to spend the resources on public education that it should. So,
I do agree. Harvey's brought this up 2 times now. I do agree largely with that if you're trying to fix a problem, and I mean, especially if you're a parent, you know this, if you're trying to fix a problem by the time the kid is 18 and applying to college, you are so far beyond at that point being able to do anything, government or parents. Like, no, like at that point, you're like the kid has to go to boot camp or the military or something. Like, yeah. So the heavy investments really need to be made. Those early years in life are crucial. Man, if you make it to 5th or 6th grade and you can barely read, even as early as that, you're just, everything in life is just so hopeless for you. Yeah.
Yeah. So it shouldn't be used as just a crutch, but there's a time and place for it. Harvey, I have a question. Given your experience with free speech, what do you make of the proposed law to make criticism of Israel part of, to define that as anti-Semitism? What do you make of that?
Oh, I think it's terrible. Yeah. I think that the Middle East situation is one of those truly intractable disputes in the world. There have been opportunities. I think that it's tragic that Yasser Arafat did not accept the 2-state solution. I think a 2-state solution is the only solution to the Middle East problem. I think that both sides are governed by unreasonable governments right now. I think the Netanyahu government is too fanatical to do anything about the problem other than military might. It's just one of the great tragedies in recent history, and I don't know how it's gonna work out. I would hope that Israel would have an election sooner rather than later and get rid of the Netanyahu government. It's really scandalous. My view, and maybe I'm just too cynical, is that Netanyahu is holding on to power in order to keep from facing his own tax prosecution. Is that too cynical?
What do you think, Stephen?
I mean, a lot of people make the same accusations. I mean, yeah, that could be the reason why, or it could just be that he wants to protect his legacy, and having October 7th happen and then failing, with this war would just make him seem horrible and incompetent and would be a stand on his record. But yeah. Yeah. I don't know about the anti-Semitism thing. Again, these are, especially after reading so much in the media about laws and things being passed. Like if I don't actually read the statute itself, I get really nervous taking people's other interpretation, because so much of it is presented so poorly and so not truly. So, I mean, like, if you're talking about adding criticisms of Jewish people or something into a similar realm as like other types of hate speech that can be like aggravating factors, or like, I don't even know, it's things that you add on for like certain crimes. Like if you attack somebody and then you call them the N-word, or you call them like a Jewish slur, if you want to add that on there, I guess that's okay. But obviously in the United States, we don't have any laws on hate speech, and I think it should absolutely remain that way. I mean, you should be able to criticize a country. So I would have to see how that particular law is written or what they're even talking about to know if I would support it or not.
Yeah, I actually am wholly opposed to hate speech statutes, because I actually think hate speech is extremely important to protect, because you want to know who the haters are. And if they're not allowed to express it, you don't know who they are.
Stephen, do you think we should allow hate speech? Like,
yeah, we do.
It should
we already
be,
do.
But
I don't think it should be because we need to know who they are. I just think it's because it's your First Amendment right. You have a right to, if you want to be hateful, then the government can't tell you not to be hateful. If you want to express that with certain words, as long as you're not, Brandenburg, you're not inciting people to imminent lawless action, or as long as you're not committing a crime or planning to commit a crime, you should be able to say what you want 100%. Yeah.
Stephen, earlier you asked Harvey about the pro-Palestine protests, and Harvey, I think, gave his view. What's your view about those protests? I know it's not as much in the news right now, but what's your view about the nature of those protests?
I mean, on substance, I wholly disagree. Obviously, anybody that's like protesting and waving around Houthi flags or Hamas flags, I think is pretty gross. But I mean, like, everybody has a right to protest. I think that
what about the Palestine flags? What about What about people who are just saying, "Hey, stop bombing us"?
I mean, my biggest issue on substance is that most of those people have no idea about anything going on over there. I mean, to be fair, I mean, if you're young, there's no reason to know, anything that is going over there. But it's very frustrating that, like, most people are utterly clueless but have the strongest opinions ever on the conflict, and then a lot of bad information gets passed around, and it just feels dumb. But that's on substance. In terms of like right to protest, you should be able to. A lot of people didn't understand, I guess, what time, manner, and place meant in terms of restrictions, because colleges do have a right to restrict where you can protest, or at like certain times of day you still can, but that doesn't mean that you have an unrestricted right to protest literally anywhere on campus, or block off like libraries or block people going to class or whatever. But yeah.
Do you think, Harvey, that the substance of the protests was also bad, like Stephen's saying, or do you think there was merit to the protests?
Well, I think some of the protests show an absence of knowledge of facts and history, but as long as they don't disrupt the ongoing educational process on the campus, they have a right to do it. I have no problem with encampments. I do have a problem with stopping people from passing through from one building to another. I remember I represented students during the Vietnam War over at Harvard who were following professors who were consultants at the Department of Defense. They were following them from their homes to the campus, and they were chanting, "Murderer, murderer, murderer." And the professors on the university went to court to get an injunction, and I represented the students, saying, it seems to me that as long as they keep a certain number of feet away from the professor, they can follow and they can chant all day long. And we won that case. It's traditional time, place, and manner analysis. Like you can't have a loud demonstration outside the mayor's house at 3:00 in the morning, but you can do it 3:00 in the afternoon. These are all solvable problems.
Yeah. I want to talk about cancel culture for a moment. Stephen, let me know if I've got this wrong, but I think you've mentioned cancel culture can sometimes be an effective tool for social change. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, everybody's pro cancel culture. Really, what we disagree about is like where it should apply. Right. Like, I think everybody was probably okay with Jared, the subway guy, being shamed, and but like, yeah, people go crazy sometimes, I'm sure. Yeah,
and that whereas Harvey, I think you are more purely critical of cancel culture. So the question for both of you is like, can cancel culture serve a productive role, Stephen, like you're saying, or Harvey, do you think it's just inherently damaging to civil liberties?
I think it's inherently damaging, although it's constitutionally protected. Not everything that's constitutional is wise and useful. And
should we do it?
Cancel culture seeks to diminish the quantum of views, publicly expressed views and ideas, rather than enlarge it. And in that sense, I think it's counterproductive.
Stephen, you would disagree. You'd say the case of Jared from Subway, like you got to cancel him, right?
This is one of those things where like it depends on what you mean by cancel. It depends on who you're canceling. It depends on what they did. There's just like so much, right? Like in my mind, the biggest issue with cancel culture, and actually, I guess maybe Harvey can speak to this. I feel like the issue is that right now, because we're all connected to the internet, like if you make one mistake in your personal life, literally the entire universe can come down on you and destroy you. Whereas before, if you did something dumb and, you know, people at the local, like at your supermarket or in the newspaper or at your church are talking about it, like the impact is a little bit more localized and it doesn't go through all of time and stay in history forever. I think that type of stuff is probably okay. Like there's some element of social shame that's probably important for humans to be able to interact with each other. But it's the fact that the whole internet can come down on you and destroy your life if you do something that, you know, is deemed incorrect or unsavory. I think that's the most problematic part. Yeah.
And another point where I thought there might be contention is, so Stephen, I think you have advocated for police reform and systemic changes in the justice system, whereas Harvey, you've focused more on individual rights and defending due process. So question for both of you is, should we prioritize reforming institutions, or should we prioritize protecting the rights of individuals within the current system? Which should take priority?
Well, those are not totally separable. Institutions protect individuals as well. I am more concerned with individual rights. Institutions are more capable of defending themselves than individuals are.
I don't think I've advocated for huge reform. I guess it depends on what we've been or what we're watching or talking about. I think generally, I think that they do pretty well. I think accountability mechanisms are always good. And I think that good actors generally want accountability mechanisms. Like when you look at body cams don't just protect civilians, hopefully, or citizens. They should also be protecting good cops from false accusations and stuff as well. So I think accountability mechanisms are good. Yeah. I think the big issue right now is that we have with a lot of these systems are people see one or two videos and they make huge, broad, sweeping claims about the entire system, which I think is really unfortunate because people have a really bad time in their head understanding like what is even acceptable or not. Like if I showed you a video of a cop improperly bullying a citizen one time every single week for the entire year, like would that be a bad or an acceptable amount of cop badgering of civilians, right? Obviously, we don't ever want it to happen. But I mean, how many cops do we have in this country? Most people have no idea. How many interactions are there, a year? No one has any idea. So maybe 52 bad interactions a year is actually really good considering how many cops and interactions there are. Maybe you'd expect to see that number be 500 or 1,000, but so, yeah, I think the big problem is people's perceptions of the system are just wholly and completely warped based on what they see on social media, which I think is unfortunate.
And I think you'd both agree to that. Harvey, post 9/11, you've been a critic of government surveillance, right? And yes. Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought you've mentioned that maybe that surveillance could be a necessary trade-off for security. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, some level of surveillance is. It's just a matter of figuring out what the balance is, right?
So what is that balance, Harvey, between civil liberties and national security?
Well, I think that part of the problem is that we don't have enough civilian and media oversight of some of these programs. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. During the Vietnam War, I represented a large number of conscientious objectors. And they were objectors not only on the religious grounds, which is what the statutes allowed, but they had moral and ethical objections to that particular war. It was not declared by Congress. It was considered by many to be racist. A part of the sort of anti-communist, the leftover of the McCarthy period. And what I did was I represented a lot of students and young people who refused induction, and they were indicted. And I had not one of my clients went to jail. because I convinced judges in every single case to allow my client to do alternative service. And some of them, worked in hospitals as orderlies and so forth. But quite a few did the following. They volunteered to help their local police force. And what they did, they were assigned by the judge, and so it was hard for the police force to turn down this help, is the student who was a conscientious objector to war accompanied the police officer on his or her beat. And what that did was there were no instances of police brutality because there was always a civilian witness. No cop would beat somebody up with a 20-year-old assigned to be with him by a federal judge as a witness. And that gave me an idea that I actually proposed, and it never went anywhere, but I still think it was a great idea, that a great government program, an important government program, would be to have, young people, civilians, under the guise of helping the police in public service, accompany police officers on their rounds of duty, and therefore inject a certain amount of civilian oversight into police work. Police departments are very militarized, and if you see how they train, you can understand why. So I think that there's got to be a better solution to police brutality than anything that I know we've got body cams now, and that has helped some. But there's a lot of arrogance, and a lot of it is racial in our police departments. And I think that my proposal is actually a good one.
Stephen, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think that having citizens plugged into police stuff more is always a good idea. So they get understanding of what's going on.
What about corporate versus government censorship? I mean, do you guys think that censorship by private companies like Twitter or Facebook is as dangerous as government censorship? I think, Harvey, you've defended against state overreach, whereas Stephen, you've spoken about the responsibilities of those platforms. Should the standards differ? I mean, there's like
in theory and there's in practice. In theory, government censorship is way more scary because the government could throw you in prison and deprive you of other types of essential rights or liberties. In practice, I think that it seems like the social media companies are more scary because if you get banned if YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter decide to ban you, you have no more speech. It feels like you're just done. Nobody's going to hear anything you're going to say. Your reach is so severely limited. So it seems like they can effectively control your ability to speak. But yeah, again, we go back to the issue of these are private individuals, and to place restrictions on how they restrict your speech would be a restriction on their speech. So it just puts you in a really weird world.
So what do we do with that catch-22, Harvey, that Stephen's bringing up?
Well, it is catch-22, and catch-22s are difficult to deal with by definition. I am opposed to heavy-handed government regulations of private means of communication. I think the solution is going to have to be to have more competition, more of these private, right now is between Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, they've got it sewed up. I think that if we have more of these avenues, there will be, it will be safer for society. And I'd rather let the marketplace work that out than have the government work it out.
Okay. And sorry.
No, yeah,
we talked about free speech and cancel culture. My final question is, when it comes to, we've touched on this issue, but I want to bring up a specific question. So when it comes to free speech in the academic setting, I think, Stephen, we've talked about limits in certain contexts to protect marginalized groups. So when and where and how should universities protect, should they protect all speech, or do the universities have a responsibility to shield students from certain ideas? What do you think, Stephen?
I think that I grew up hardcore. I didn't grow up this. My 18 to 20 period was very libertarian, so I'm stealing a lot from like Penn Jillette, and in my Ron Paul days and everything. I still like the idea of colleges are kind of this last area where you can encounter like the most horrific ideas ever, but you're in a pretty safe environment. It's just college. Not to demean anybody's college experience, but you're not in the workplace. You can't get fired for harassment. You can experiment with stuff, and you've got college professors and fellow students to engage with critically on these ideas. So the idea of starting to restrict what people can hear when they're already in college, I think is very sad, because it should be like the last opportunity you have to encounter any of these types of things. So, whether that means, bad speakers going to college campuses, or, controversial demonstrations happening, insofar as they're not breaking any laws, they're following all your time, manner, place restrictions, they're doing everything they should be. I think that, you should expect to see a wide variety of views, occurring on college campuses. That should be the expectation. Yeah.
But should they restrict any kind of speech?
No, I don't think so. As long as it's not unlawful. Yeah.
Yeah. Got it. Guys, thanks so much for both your times. Any final thoughts, questions, Stephen, Harvey, anything we didn't cover that you want to bring up about?
I think we got through everything that I can think of. Yeah.
We got through a lot of stuff, huh? So thanks so much. This was great. I appreciate the friendly disagreement and all the different topics that we covered today. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for dealing with my badgering, and I appreciate it. Yeah.
To be continued after the trial and stuff, and we'll, like you said, Harvey, you want the "I told you so" moment, so maybe we can do a round 2.
All right.
Yeah. Well, not yet, but once it's done. Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot. I'll see you later.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye.